Welcome back to the Nauti Archaeologist podcast. My name is Lauren Kuntz, and I am now and forever will be your navigator and host on this podcast. However, I don't narrate all of it. You don't have to listen to my dulcet tones for the entire time. Usually we do have some guests that come on this podcast, and for that reason, we do this podcast in a season, and we are not a regular once a week, forever and always podcast. So thanks for sticking with us. We really appreciate you listening. We love talking about shipwrecks on this podcast, and eventually we're going to talk about some submerged cities as well. But let's get to the meat of today's episode. Today we'll be discussing a ship that has gone by several nicknames, a few of which are more well-known than others. Sometimes it's called the Goonies shipwreck for the 1985 film that was greatly inspired by the legends and lore of this ship. It has also gone by the Beeswax wreck, because it has deposited several tons of chunks of beeswax on the Nehalem Bay area on the north coast of Oregon, among other artifacts. The real name of this shipwreck, as we will come to find out, is the Santo Cristo de Burgos, a Manila Galleon sailing under the flag of Spain.
Avast! It's complicit. The timbers were way too big, but what really tells the story are thousands of pieces. We looked at them all. The treasure was not gold or silver, it was the people.
Welcome back, everyone. And thanks again for joining us. Our story today starts on the northwest Oregon coast, where 300 years of legends tell of buried treasure and lost galleons full of rich cargo. From the late 1960s and until the end of the millennium, Oregon permitted treasure hunting along its rocky beaches. And during the 32-ish years that Oregon allowed this, 93% of the permit requests were for the Nauti area, just north of Nehalem Bay. For almost 300 years, legends of a shipwreck and buried treasure, only encouraged by movies like The Goonies, permeated the local gossip, indigenous oral tradition, as well as historic periodicals. Seemingly all confirmed by the beeswax chunks and the little pieces of porcelain that were washing up along the shores. No one really knew the true story. Oregon's coastline is littered with shipwrecks. It could have been any one of them. They thought maybe it could be one, or it could be three. It is, after all, a very rocky, very dangerous coastline. Only 4 Manila Galleons, part of a trade route in the Pacific Ocean that went from Manila, Philippines, to around San Francisco latitudes, and then south along the North American coastline down to Acapulco, New Spain at that point, Mexico today. Only 4 Manila Galleons were ever truly lost to Spain. Spain was pretty good at keeping a record of where their galleons sank. They knew at least kind of general areas, and they could send people out to go and recover cargo that was possibly just floating around in the ocean where their galleon had sank. The thing about galleons, it's like putting half of your economy on a boat and then watching it sail off into the sunset. Fingers crossed, it makes it to its destination. There are so many things that can go wrong, and this poor shipwreck just had everything go wrong. But we know this because the researchers have done the work. There were only 4 ships completely lost that Spain had no idea what was going on with. That was the San Juanillo, lost in 1578, the San Juan, lost in 1586, the Santo Cristo de Burgos, lost in 1693, and the San Francisco Javier, lost in 1705. Now, 3 of those ships are still missing. We still don't know what happened to them, but we have been able to identify one. And by we, I mean the scientists that have been working on this. Now, Spain lost more ships than that. Ships sink all the time. But because Spain kept really good records, only 4 were the ones that went missing. Now 2 can be ruled out because the porcelain that continuously washes up on shores of Nauti Bay is Kangxi-style porcelain from the Qing dynasty, which is a revival of Song dynasty technique. What that means is they've been able to use the patterns that are on these little bits of china, these porcelain pieces, and identify them specifically to a time frame. The Qing dynasty was right around the turn of the 18th century. So the San Juan and the San Juanillo, which were lost before the turn of the 17th century, are too early. Now, the San Juan and the San Juanillo were likely still carrying these luxury goods. However, the Santo Cristo de Burgos and the San Francisco Javier are now the two most likely culprits. Researchers with the Maritime Archaeology Society out of Astoria, Oregon, started the Beeswax wreck project in 2006-ish. Now, it was slow going, there was not a lot of funding going around, and they did a lot of the research on their own. However, around 2017-2018, they had a breakthrough. Geologists and geomorphologists were able to take a look with ground-penetrating radar and see a record of what happened within the strata of the Earth itself. Let the beach tell the story. And here's where context becomes so important, because these artifacts are key to this. Using the placement of the artifacts, scientists were able to determine when exactly this shipwreck had sank. Here's the thing. They initially thought that the Santo Cristo de Burgos had burned off the coast of the Marianas Islands. Additionally, something to note, there was a massive, catastrophic earthquake that struck the Cascadia fault line in 1700. So between the loss of these two ships. So because of the tsunami, scientists assumed it would have destroyed whatever was left of this shipwreck. And so they assumed initially that this shipwreck was the San Francisco Javier, based on the story of the Santo Cristo de Burgos' destruction off the coast of the Marianas, as well as the possibility that a tsunami would have destroyed any remains of what could have been of the Santo Cristo had it been that shipwreck. So initially there's this hypothesis. Because I want to talk about the earthquake real quick. This earthquake was catastrophic. Quoting from Earthquakes Canada, quote, "The earthquake shaking collapsed houses of the Cowichan people on Vancouver Island and caused numerous landslides. The shaking was so violent that people could not stand and so prolonged that it made them sick. On the west coast of Vancouver Island, the tsunami completely destroyed the winter village of the Pachena Bay people with no survivors. These events are recorded in the oral traditions of the First Nations people on Vancouver Island. The tsunami swept across the Pacific, also causing destruction along the Pacific coast of Japan. It is the accurate descriptions of the tsunami and the accurate timekeeping by the Japanese that allows us to confidently know the size and exact time of this great earthquake." End quote. And according to the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, this happened in what's called the Cascadia subduction zone. This megathrust fault is over 1,000 kilometers long, and it stretches from northern Vancouver Island to Cape Mendocino, California. The Juan de Fuca plate moved towards and ultimately was shoved beneath the North American plate. Fun fact, the Juan de Fuca plate is actually just disappearing. It is getting eaten by the North American plate. I cannot understate how enormous this earthquake was. So the scientists with the Maritime Archaeology Society weren't far off in thinking that the tsunami would have destroyed any remains of any kind of shipwreck in the bay. So the San Francisco Javier hypothesis makes sense. But something wasn't adding up for the scientists, and they found that there's artifacts within the strata that they're finding in this tsunami debris and this tsunami gunk that they're finding at like 50, 75 feet above sea level. This is something that storm waves won't reach, something normal wave height doesn't accomplish. The only way these artifacts would have been at that level is if a tsunami had pushed them there, indicating the shipwreck had happened before the tsunami, not after. These scientists, Scott Williams, Kurt D. Peterson, Mitch Markin, and Richard Rogers, wrote up their findings for the Oregon Historical Quarterly in 2018, which was a series of articles, a special edition, that was primarily focused on this shipwreck, which has been nicknamed the Beeswax wreck, for the beeswax that it deposited on the beaches. Additionally, there were 3 other articles written by Cameron LaFollette, our guest on today's episode. La Follette, together with Douglas Dürr and Esther Gonzalez, as well as several other researchers from around the world, were then able to take the name of the shipwreck, the Santo Cristo de Burgos, now that the archaeologists had named it, and she was able to run with it. In her interview on the show today, Cameron La Follette is going to go over how she figured out what happened to the Santo Cristo de Burgos. What we don't talk about is an exact timeline, so let me give that to you prefaced here before we go into the interview. The Santo Cristo de Burgos was built in Sorsogon, Philippines in 1687, possibly 1688, and it had been making regular trips with no issue to Acapulco, quote-unquote, New Spain, modern-day Mexico, for a couple of years with no issue. But in 1690, it had a highly irregular voyage. Francisco de Arcocha, the commander of the Santo Cristo de Burgos, arrived in New Spain on schedule, but Gaspar de la Cerda Silva Sandoval y Mendoza, 8th Count of Galve and Viceroy of New Spain, fired Arcocha and replaced him with a man named Don Bernardo Iñiguez del Valle, along with the boatswain, the master, and the sergeant major. These changes surprised the crew, and it ruined de Arcocha and his reputation. He didn't do this for no reason, although it was petty. It seems that on the voyage prior, de Arcocha had transported Don Gabriel de Arnedo y Escudero, whom de la Cerda wanted as commander instead of de Arcocha, calling him, quote, a gentleman of his household. It was also the reason de la Cerda wanted de Arnedo as commander. He knew him. Arcocha, instead of ceding command to Escudero, simply kept him on as a passenger. For this perceived slight, and despite de Arcocha being appointed by the Spanish governor of the Philippines colony, de la Cerda fired de Arcocha, naming Del Valle as the new commander, and replaced the other leadership as a point of likely staving off mutiny to make the trip back to Manila. They returned to Manila in 1691, along with about 155,500 pesos from the crown to help with the maintenance of the colony, a little over 24,000 of which was set aside for the ecclesiastical needs of the missionaries there. Like I said, these galleons are lifelines, and without them, colonies can sink just like their ships. The Santo Cristo de Burgos would not set sail again until 1692. But that voyage was disastrous. Around October, Del Valle and his crew entered a storm that severely damaged the foremast and the mainmast. In an effort to mitigate some of the damage, Del Valle caused a chain of events that actually resulted in further loss. This damage caused the loss of 3 masts after they decided to attempt to cut them down. They rigged up provisional sails, and after calling a committee, a council, essentially, Del Valle and his crew decided to return to Manila in what's called an arribada in November of 1692. However, Del Valle's committee decided not to return to Cavite and instead sought safety in the Bay of Naga, modern-day San Miguel Bay. It's still in the Manila region, but it's on the east side of the island. The shipyard there was not as outfitted as Cavite, and there was some debate among colony officials as to whether or not to repair the ship there, but they ultimately settled on, that's just what we're going to have to do. Del Valle and his arribada cost the Philippine colony a full year of income, and it left the economy in shambles. There was no exchange of goods between New Spain's Acapulco and Manila, with essentially a chunk of the economy sitting on a beach in Naga Bay for the next 6 months. It was too late in the season for the Santo Cristo de Burgos to set sail again. It would take approximately 6 to 8 months to even reach Acapulco, and then another 3 months to return home to Manila. So there was only 1 galleon a year, and you only had a very small window of time in the spring to launch. And late June is playing fast and loose with that deadline. Manila galleons had a very treacherous route on the way to Acapulco, which is why it took more time to get there than to come home. The investigation continued into the following year, 1693, and Del Valle, Upset with some of the findings, and on July 1st, 1693, simply left, leaving behind approximately 30 men that he likely would have needed in the crossing. And that's where our record ends. But this is also where Cameron La Follette was able to take the clues and follow the breadcrumbs, and she has much more detail. Joining me today for our episode is Cameron La Follette, who has done a lot of the research on the Santo Cristo de Burgos and published a lot of her findings in the Oregon Historical Quarterly in 2018. Her articles are the main source for this episode. So because of that, let's bring her in to talk about it. Thank you so much for talking to me about the history of the Santo Cristo de Burgos. Let's get started. How did you get involved with this? Because Oregon does have so much history and legend and the Mountain of a Thousand Holes, right? Tell me about how you got started with all this.
So I was and am the land use director, or the executive director for a land use watchdog organization that focuses on the coast. And in that position, I work with local people up and down the coast to oppose projects that are ill-considered or don't fit their area or that would really reduce the livability for people in the community, and work with them to protect coastal natural resources. And so as a result of that, I had to know the relatively recent history of various things on the coast. Like, when was that particularly controversial subdivision proposed back in the 1980s? Or, about the farthest back that I really thought about history on the coast was 1970s, with the exception of a couple of much earlier things that were impacting current land use controversies. So I didn't think, I've always been interested in history and read a lot of history, but for my work, I did need to have knowledge about a lot of things on the coast, where the city limits are and where the urban growth boundaries are and what's being proposed by this county and what's being proposed by that city, and who are the local people who care about land use issues in their communities, and what are the geological problems in particular areas that might lead to difficulties with a development, and so on. But there wasn't anything, generally speaking, more specific or further back than that I needed in terms of history. But in 2014, there was a proposal for a resort project on an area in Tillamook County, which is on the north coast, called Bay Ocean Spit. And as it so happened, there was a resort, an actual resort town on Bay Ocean Spit in the very early 1900s, which had ultimately failed and literally fallen into the sea as a result of one jetty being built at the mouth of Tillamook Bay rather than two. And that destabilized the wave patterns in the area and caused a tremendous amount of erosion to the spit on the south. And the town eventually fell into the sea. It was called Bay Ocean Park. And it's quite famous in Oregon history because it fell into the sea. So eventually the open ocean poured into Tillamook Bay. This was in finally the spit breached in the 1950s after some decades of erosion. Open ocean poured into Tillamook Bay, and there was a big outcry and an effort to get it repaired. And so the Army Corps of Engineers did eventually repair Bay Ocean Spit with a dike and some other things. And so the spit is once again where it used to be. It's skinnier than it used to be, but at least it's there. So the spit has been zoned for a variety of uses that do not include resorts for quite a while, but this, as a result of that, but there was a proposal for a resort there, and I wanted to look at more historical materials about Bay Ocean Park and where exactly the spit had breached and how did they do their sewer and water back then in 1902 and things like that. It happened that the Tillamook Pioneer Museum in the city of Tillamook was having an extended exhibit on Bay Ocean Park. They own a lot of the
Cool.
old photos and the old materials from the city, the town, the resort town. And so I wanted to know when that exhibit was going to occur and how long it was going to be up. So I went to the website of the Tillamook Pioneer Museum in order to find out those things. And on their homepage, they had a little boxed announcement that there was going to be a talk by an archaeologist about the Manila Galleon that wrecked on Halem Spit, which is another spit, sand spit not too far away from Bay Ocean Spit. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, really? A Manila Galleon? That's Spanish. And that certainly has to have been more than 200 years ago. And I was just fascinated by it automatically, immediately upon seeing that announcement. I knew nothing about it. I'd never heard of it. I wasn't involved in shipwrecks. I grew up in Arizona, which is not by the ocean, and had no relationship to the ocean throughout my childhood and middle years. But I was really fascinated by the idea of a Spanish galleon, of all unusual things, wrecking on the Oregon coast. And so the archaeologist's name was there. And so I contacted the Maritime Archaeological Society with which he worked to get a little more information. And he had a little more information from some of the reports that he'd written up and the ongoing investigations. But I wanted more information than that, much more. All of a sudden, I wanted to know everything. And I don't even know exactly why, because I'd never been interested in shipwrecks particularly. I hadn't read about them. I was not a person who had, a shelf full of books about shipwrecks of the world. But all of a sudden, I was just absolutely fascinated. It just happened all at once. They say it's possible to fall in love all at once, and I guess that's true.
You never know when it's going to strike.
Not necessarily only with people, but with events and, historical tragedies and places and so on. So I couldn't find anything out about this wreck outside of what the Maritime Archaeological Society had and shared with me. So I discussed the matter with a colleague, and we ultimately decided that it would be worthwhile through his academic contacts, since he's a professor at Portland State University, to hire a researcher in Spain, because with a little research, I had discovered that the principal records for the Spanish Empire were in Seville at the Archive of the Indies, as it's called in English, the Archivo General de las Indias in Spanish. So through his contacts, his professional contacts out there in the world, we did discover a really good researcher in Seville who had the highest recommendation from Doug's colleagues. And so, sight unseen, because I'm not in Seville, I hired her and told her the name of the ship that the Maritime Archaeological Society thought was involved here, and asked her to please research what there might be in the Archive of the Indies. Now, we didn't know, nobody knew, including the Maritime Archaeological Society, for certain that the ship was the Santo Cristo de Burgos.
Right.
But the Archaeological Society had done a large amount of sleuthing, essentially, to determine that it probably was that ship. It had been thought before their work that it was the San Francisco Xavier of 1705, I think it is. And it turned out that that was almost certainly not true. And the reason being is that the tsunami of 1700 took place between the Santo Cristo de Burgos, which was lost in 1693-94, and the San Francisco Xavier, which was lost in 1705. And they were able to map the known location of some of the wreckage on the spit, which was very much higher on the spit than would be the case if there had not been a tsunami. I mean, wrecked ships do not land on the top of the sand spit, right? They land much further down by the sea.
They tend not to fly.
They tend not to. So I didn't know. The Archaeological Society did not have the funds or the necessity for their archaeological work to do additional historical research, but my interest was all historical. I have a degree in journalism, and was really interested in seeing what are we missing something in Oregon's historical, narrative here. So we hired this researcher, and over the period of a couple of years, she began to find more and more and more things ferreted away in the Seville archive. She knew where to look and how to look, and that's a very important part of this, because that archive uses a completely different, what's the right word, organizational system for its documents. The way Americans would organize documents in an archive is completely not the way the Archive of the Indies is organized. And that seems like an unimportant and even boring aspect of the matter. But if an American researcher had tried to do work in there without being familiar with the organizational system, they would have found extremely zero out of
Right.
documents.
Well, and additionally, I think most Americans, even when we learn Spanish, so like I haven't been fluent for like 10 years, but I learned Spanish when I did my field school in Peru for archaeology, and I got like pretty good at it, but it's all very like South American accented and dialect. And so if I were to go and attempt to research something in Spain, they speak Castellano. It's a completely different dialect. And then you're additionally researching 15th century Castellano, which is akin to Old English in some respects of the metaphor.
And also, it is the case that the documents have a lot of nautical terminology from the mid to late 17th century, and they're all handwritten, of course.
Oh.
Typewriters had not been invented were not going to be invented for centuries. And the handwriting is not really what we would normally expect. It's often very loopy and lots of curlicues. And so it's Old Castilian, lots of nautical terms, handwritten in a very ornamental style that's most unlike what we have all been taught to read. And so there would not have been any chance at all of making any headway without a researcher who was highly familiar with all of those things. So over the couple of years involved here, as she sent me more and more reports showing the tragic history of this ship, which culminated in an entire crew and officer list, which is very unusual for the late 17th century. Very. I realized that Doug and I realized, my principal co-author and I realized that a major part of Oregon's historical narrative was not had not ever been brought to light at all. The last article in Oregon's historical journal of record is the Oregon Historical Quarterly, put out by the Oregon Historical Society. And the last article they had on the galleon was an article about the shipper's marks on the Beeswax blocks, which was published in 1911. So that's how I got into it originally. And I should say that once we got more and more reports from Spain, I realized meantime, I had been reading up madly on Manila Galleons, which was a big deal because I didn't know anything about them except that they were Spanish. That was it. So I had to look at maps. Where are they built? Where do they go? When do they do it? Do they go north? Do they go south? What happens if the cargo in the Manila Galleon is going to go on to Spain? Do they go all the way around South America? No, they put it on donkeys and cross the Isthmus of Panama and then picked it up into another ship on the other side, on the east side of South America.
The pre-Panama Canal.
Yeah, definitely. But I didn't know any of those things. Had never been an interest field. So I was madly, while Esther was sending me reports, I was madly reading book after book after book after book on Manila Galleons and the Manila trade and the Spanish Empire and the life aboard Spanish ships in the 17th centuries, everything I could find to try to give myself enough background to be able to speak relatively intelligently about this. And one of the things I realized in my reading is that Manila Galleons were the first truly global trading system. Many kingdoms and countries had regional and local trading systems, including the Philippines, who were, it's a set of islands. And so the Filipino people the coastal people were very good with boats and boat building. And there was an extensive and rich trade regionally between China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Guam, that area. but it was the Spanish ocean-going ships that really made it the first global trade. And so I realized it isn't going to be enough to just hire someone in Spain, because one of the things that I learned from Esther's reports was that the ship was built in the Philippines. So that means that probably there would be information about the ship and or its troubles or its crew or something in the Spanish section of the National Archives of the Philippines. So I needed to hire somebody there to look. And I did do that and did find some documents about the ship in the Philippines. And then I realized also that there probably would be documents in Mexico, because that's where the ship was going. And that's where it had gone the year before, or 2 years before, Acapulco. And so it was necessary to hire somebody in Mexico City in order to look into the archive of the nation, Archivo de la Nación, in Mexico City. So it all became much more international than I thought it was going to be once I really got into this. Once we discovered who the captain was, the Maritime Archaeological Society had his name, but nothing else about him. I kept trying to find information out about the captain, since the captain on any ship at that time was the key officer, the principal person, the man in charge in all circumstances. And I couldn't find anything at all about him. And it came to me one afternoon out of the blue, completely, having looked around. I thought, maybe if I look up lists of Spanish names, I'll find nothing. So then it suddenly occurred to me, well, maybe he was Basque, because I read in one of the books that the Basques were very important in the overseas Spanish Empire. They had a long tradition of seafaring and shipbuilding, because their country, their region is right on the ocean, unlike much of the rest of Spain. And so I looked up online, I put his name in, and then, plus Basque names. And I immediately got a list of Basque names, and there was that name, Iniguez del Valle. And I thought, all right, now we're making progress. I don't know where I got that lightning bolt from, but so I read a history of the Basque people just in order to acquaint myself a little bit with their history and their culture, and eventually learned that from the material that Esther was sending from Seville, learned that Captain Del Valle had been born and raised in Tudela, which is in the north of the country, in the Basque country. And I thought, I need someone who understands and knows and is familiar with the Basque country, and I don't know where to go for that. So I went on the website of Principal University in Vitoria-Gasteiz. I speak enough Spanish to get by, not to be totally fluent, but enough to get by.
Same, enough to get into problems and then to probably get kind of out of them.
You're right. So I just went on the university website, found a professor whose field included, according to his little bio, 18th century Basque economy and maritime matters. And I emailed him completely cold in English, hoping that he spoke enough English to, do this.
Yeah.
And I figured he could either reply or not reply. So, but I did get a very nice reply in English from him, and he was really interested and offered to help, and he did help enormously. It was he who discovered that Captain Del Valle was a member of the Knights of Santiago, which was an elite military organization open to noblemen only, not, commoners. And it was he who found the application, and the application was, thank goodness, very thorough, and allowed me to find the names of Del Valle's parents and his grandparents, and what work they had done, what position they had held in the community. And it was through this professor that our greatest coup came, which was finding a painting of Captain Del Valle. That was really, I can't remember exactly how I found out that before he became the galleon captain, he had gone to Mexico, as many young to middle-aged Spanish men did at the time, in order to have new opportunities and adventure and so on. And he was a military man. And he was appointed as the mayor of a town in the highlands of Mexico called San Luis de Potosí, which was a mining town. And they hoped it was going to be as rich in silver as Potosí itself, which is now in Bolivia, much further south. But as a military man with good experience, he was appointed the mayor for 2 years there. And this professor happened, by happenstance, is there happenstance in something like this, to have a colleague who was the town historian in that town, San
Of
Luis
course.
Potosí. So he offered to email her and find out what there was, and so he did that. And she responded with some city council, we would call them city council minutes
Mhm.
of the period in which he was mayor and his work as mayor. And she sent him just a snapshot, from an iPhone of a painting of Del Valle, which is in a neighborhood church in San Luis de Potosí. And he sent it to me. And when I got that on my email, I was just like, oh, wow, look at that. A painting that shows Captain Del Valle. Uh, I was completely shocked because at that time, paintings, portraits were
Mhm.
generally restricted to to royalty and the very high nobility. Like the viceroy of New
Yes.
Spain had his portrait always painted, so we know what all the viceroys of New Spain looked like. Galleon captains were star people, but not that high up on the hierarchy that they would have their
Right.
portraits painted.
Like, you would expect people like the Medicis to have these
Right.
commissioned and these painted of them, and, like, they would, of course, commission religious art, but they would often put themselves at the feet of the master.
But not a galleon captain. But he was not at that point a galleon captain. The reason that he was in a painting, and it still is in a painting in a neighborhood church, is that as the mayor, San Luis de Potosí had serious flooding problems apparently every year, and nobody had ever been able to deal with it. And he, realizing that what the flooding problem was and how best it could be solved, which was to build a ditch around the town to carry off the floodwaters. But the town didn't have enough money to do that, so he
Mhm.
acted as a nobleman should in that time and place. He paid for more than half of it out of his own private funds.
That's such a generous offer to help with, and I can't help but wonder if that was the n so it's the expectation, yes, but I wonder if that was the norm.
I don't know whether that was the norm. I have not ever seen any paperwork on that. It was generally the norm, I think, that noblemen having resources of their own were expected to be generous, to be hidalgos, to be
Mhm.
gentlemen. Whether or not that included paying for more than half of a flood control project in a poor Mexican town in the Highlands, I don't know. But he did that. The city paid for the rest, for the town. The ditch was built. It was called La Zanja. And the next time it rained hard, all the flood water went off in the ditch and the town was not subject to floods. And so
We're saved.
it was a very grateful town. And so the painting was done showing him and the head of the waterworks, the chief of the waterworks, both worshiping the Virgin Mary, which was a very common way to portray people in that period in Spain and New Spain. And so I eventually got a better copy of the photo from them in San Luis de Potosí, and it was published in Oregon Historical Quarterly. We know for sure that it was Don Bernardo Iniguez del Valle in the painting because the caption at the bottom of it says so.
Amazing.
And he looked just like I thought he would. That was the really interesting thing. He looked like I thought he would. He's dressed in military uniform, which is appropriate because he was a military man. And otherwise, he looked as I thought he would. So that was the red letter day of everything, was getting that painting.
Like, that is really cool. I am amazed that that painting survived over the years. The only way it could have survived was in a church, just hanging where it was.
And it's not an important church in the grand scheme of things.
Mhm.
It's not the town cathedral. It's just a neighborhood church. And it's probably a painting that 99% of the people who go in there don't even look at. It's just an old painting on the wall.
Yeah.
But the town historian, of course, would know about such a thing. That's the business of a town historian, is to know all the
Mhm.
details of their place. And so she knew right away that she found the town minutes that explored his building the ditch and offering to pay for it. And the town minutes also expressed the town's appreciation and their decision to commission the painting. It gave, I already had a high opinion of local historians, but after that experience,
Yeah.
I have a really high opinion of local historians.
Local historians do the work. I love it. So let's talk about what brought Del Bio to Manila.
So at the time that he was appointed the galleon captain, He was the head of the cavalry system in Mexico City, I think. He had finished his 2-year stint at San Luis de Potosí, and he was in Mexico City. And the Santo Cristo de Burgos had come in, and its captain, Francisco de Aracocha, was fired, I guess is the right word, by the viceroy
Sacked.
of New Spain. The records are clear in an unclear kind of way. That is, if you knew about the political back and forth that was going on, the description of why this happened would have made sense. But
Mhm.
since neither I nor anybody else now has the intimate details of the political back and forth and the insult that was offered and the way the viceroy felt about it and all that, the explanation is kind of slightly incomprehensible. But it is the case that there was some kind of insult offered to a man honored by and respected by and possibly employed by the viceroy. And as a result of that, the Captain Aracocha was let go. And this was distressful to merchants in the area because he was a galleon captain with experience. And since we are talking about the late 1600s here, and what we would refer to as modern navigational tools were generally not available, experience and knowledge of coastlines and of weather patterns was extremely important, much more
Well,
so probably than now.
and I believe that there's Aracocha, who is essentially, he is captain, but not in the sense that, like, we understand the word captain. He's kind of the president, and then there is, like, a governor in a sense of, like, there is a sailor captain, and he deals with the sailor stuff, but as I understand it, the sailing stuff comes second to the soldier stuff.
There's always a captain who has the ultimate
Mhm.
authority. The people who really ran the ship were the pilots,
Oh, okay.
of which on a Manila Galleon there were usually at least two and sometimes three or four. Partly because of experience, partly because it's a really big ship,
Mhm.
and partly because this is the gruesome part, the death rate was so high. Manila galleons took at least 6 months, unless under extraordinary circumstances, to reach from Manila to Acapulco. After 6 months, scurvy will set in. Actually, quite
Mhm.
before that, scurvy will usually set in within 3 or 4 months of not having adequate vitamin C. The death rate on Manila galleons was in the vicinity of 30% of the crew, and it didn't pay attention to high ranking or low ranking people because everybody lacked for vitamin C. Upper class passengers and officers could bring their own food, and they usually did because it would be better quality. But if you're going to be on a 6 to 8 month voyage, you have to bring things that aren't going to spoil. So it was things like chocolate or garbanzo beans in oil or
No.
jerky, which are all fine and good and taste nice, but don't have any vitamin C. It was not known at that time what was missing. It was recognized that it had something to do with the diet because when people went ashore and ate normal shore food, they got better. But that doesn't really help very much. Now you could do what later the British Army did, which was give everybody a teaspoonful of or a tablespoonful of lime juice or orange juice or dried oranges or whatever.
Mhm.
But that wasn't really known then. So the pilots were the ones who were responsible for getting the ship from A to B. They had training, they had knowledge, they had experience. The captain was not necessarily a man of nautical expertise, and some captains had none. Del Bio is a good example. He had
Yep.
none. So, but he was appointed, the viceroy appointed him, and off he went to Manila. And so the ship was then careened there for almost a whole year before it set off on its next trip, which was again to Acapulco in 1692.
So once he returned back from Acapulco and the 1692 voyage was completed, they attempted another voyage in June of 92, if I remember. No, that is the one where they did the change up was the 1692 voyage. And then in 1693, that was
Right. So Del Bio did, when he was in Mexico City and came to the Philippines as the new captain, we don't know exactly what he did in the Philippines while the ship was careened that whole year out, had a house and whatever.
went to church a lot.
Yeah, or yeah, maybe he did some local trading and we don't know. The record is silent about that. But then when he when the ship was ready, they left in the summer of 1692 to go to Acapulco, and that was the disastrous trip in which they ran into a terrible storm in what the Spanish called the Embucadero,
Right.
the San Bernardino Straits, and they lost all three masts and were really in a bad state. And Del Bio apparently wanted to continue on to Acapulco,
We can
but
make it.
under the laws of the galleon, as the commander, he was obligated to call a committee of the officers, and they universally decided to go back to the Philippines because, as they pointed out, the North Pacific, which they would have to cross, is quite stormy. And even though they could jerry rig a mast or two,
Some
that
provisional sales.
that might not last in the constant storms that
Yeah.
assailed ships in the North Pacific. So they limped back to the Philippines and ended up in the first bay that was available, which is the Bay of Nagas, Nagas Bay.
I wonder what provisional sales to them was. Like, was it just like a couple of t-shirts strung up with some, hempen cord, or did they have like I imagine they probably had some like spare canvas and a couple of like attempts at raising what used to be the mast.
Well, remember, a Manila Galleon was essentially a floating house, and
Right.
among the crew were ironworkers, sailmakers,
Carpenters.
so you had among the crew, which was more than 100 people at least,
Mhm.
in Manila Galleon, you had among the crew very necessary people who could do all kinds of important repairs.
He had his whole crew at this point.
At that point, he had his whole crew. It was expected on a long voyage that many repairs would be necessary, that a sail would go into tatters or that a mast would be taken down. They probably had spare masts and they certainly had spare sails in the hold in order to make these necessary repairs. So it really was a question of, did they have, in the opinion of the committee, did they have enough material to make really strong, sturdy repairs to get all the way across the North Pacific, or just enough to get back to the Philippines? And they decided that.
The arribada.
The arribada, the return. And Spanish officials in the Philippines were not happy with the arribada, the return. And the reason for that is almost the entire economy of the Philippines, or at least the Spanish-controlled part of the Philippines, was based on the annual Manila Galleon. The trade of, or the selling of Asian luxury goods in New Spain and other areas in South America, and also on into Spain. And since there was, generally speaking, except under extraordinary circumstances, and right at the beginning of the Spanish occupation, there was generally only one galleon a year in each direction. And it was, to say inelegantly, stuffed to the gills with Asian luxury goods. And these were magnificent, gorgeous things. I mean, being the world's most renowned poet wouldn't give you enough language to say all the beautiful things. There was cinnamon and pepper and embroidered silks and gold threaded silks and ivory statuettes and lacquer furniture and silk painted fans. I mean, it just went on and on and on with these gorgeous items from the Far East that were highly, highly coveted in New Spain and Spain itself.
I have a book on Chinese art history, and so I was looking up like some of the Kangxi China and some of its elements and design motifs, and a lot of it was really popular because it was small monochromes and classic perfections, from surface color and like down to the subtlety of restraint. It's all very Song Dynasty resurgence in it was all very prized for it's like the way Europe really prized the classics when Pompeii was discovered in the 18th century. And so they really went back, and what's called now neoclassic style is because they just really loved what was going on in ancient Rome, and so they mimicked that in the present contemporary time frame. And so it all is very much like that, and that's why a lot of these goods were so popularized, was because it was all like, oh, it's classical, it's old, it's vintage.
And you bring up something that is really important, which is a major cargo item was Chinese porcelain, in addition to the silks. The Chinese porcelain, which was white and delicately painted, mostly in blue, which was highly prized in both Spain and New Spain, and was, not everybody could afford it, of course. So there rose a fairly large class of Mexican craftsmen who were able to mimic the Spanish, the Chinese porcelain for consumers in New Spain who wanted the style but couldn't afford the real deal that came over the sea. And then the other thing that was really important in Manila Galleons in this period was beeswax. That sounds like a highly uninteresting item, and it was not a luxury item exactly, but American bees did not, before honeybees were imported here from elsewhere, American bees make no or very minimal amounts of wax. And so beeswax is the best lighting in the candle world. It's smokeless, the candles burn for a long time, and it has a good strong flame. And in addition, the Catholic Church required that beeswax candles be used in all rituals in the church. And of course, the Spanish and those whom they converted in New Spain were all Catholic. And so it was essential that there be beeswax candles. So sometimes the beeswax was made, it was all made in the Philippines. And sometimes it was put in the ships in big blocks. And sometimes it was in the form of candles. And both of those eventually later showed up on the Oregon coast. So we know that both of those were done. But it was a large industry, apparently, in the Philippines to make beeswax for the Manila Galleon trade. So during the year or so, the many months of repairing the poor ship that limped back into Nagas Bay, among other things, the cargo had to all be taken off because some of it was salt damaged, but also just to be, recounted and reordered. Smuggling was a hugely profitable, probably essential to the economy, and absolutely common event on all Manila galleons, no exceptions. We ended up not finding a full cargo list, although maddeningly, the records say that officials required a cargo list to be made from the Santo Cristo de Burgos in Naga Bay. Well, that's nice. It tells us that they made one, but that it's not there. It's not in the records. That was so frustrating. We found a partial cargo list, which gives you some ideas of what was in the cargo.
How did you know it was partial?
It was specifically mentioned to be the cargo carried by a man who was being sent back to New Spain for smuggling.
Gotcha.
Punishment for smuggling. He had some of his own goods and he had other goods on consignment from other merchants or other acquaintances. The Spanish tried ineffectually and constantly during the whole 200 and some years of the Manila Galleon trade. They tried constantly to eliminate the smuggling, and they failed completely all the time. It never stopped. And so even if we had a full cargo list, we could be sure that there were many things on board that ship that were not part of the official list. There were some tricks of the trade to make smuggling easier. Most materials being shipped were shipped in barrels, and the packers in the Philippines who were really prized were the Chinese. Now, one might not think that the ability to pack well would be something that would be highly prized, but this is the galleon cargo, and the profit that one could make was extraordinary, but only if the materials got to Acapulco not being salt damaged.
Anybody who has packed the U-Haul knows it is important to know how to pack.
Right. Well, the Chinese in the Philippines were the ones who had the expertise and were known for it and honored for it to do the packing right. So they would pack the barrels, and it was especially important in things that can easily get water damaged, like silks or silk fans, or delicate things made out of wood, things like that, or that can be easily broken, like China porcelain. But if you want to smuggle, it's very helpful to put in a lot of things at the top of the barrel, soft things like Filipino cottons and some Chinese silks, and then put the same number of nice soft things at the bottom and leave a nest in the middle where things that you're not supposed to ship can be put, like packets of cinnamon or pepper. Spices were highly valuable, or gold chains or emeralds or whatever. Out in Acapulco, then the port officials would pry open one or two barrels, look in the top, riffle through the top inch and say, okay, fine. So that was known and that was regular. Smuggling was just as common as anything. The Spanish officials also during that time in Naga Bay did a full investigation of the crew. Who was responsible for this arribada? On
Mhm.
whom should their wrath fall for ruining the year's economy by coming back to port?
What could it be that they prosecute the rich captain man?
They were actually quite thorough. They looked at everybody. I'm not the ordinary seaman who would not have had any decision-making
Well, good.
responsibility, but all the officers, and the captain. And in the result of it, the Captain Del Bio was not held responsible. He did not overload the ship. They found the ship was not overloaded, so it wasn't, poorly loaded or crookedly packed or
Mhm.
anything like
Like
that.
one-sided or
Yeah, anything that would really give it a problem in a storm. So he was exonerated of responsibility for the arribada, and ultimately the fault fell upon two men, one of whom was let me see, I want to get his name right here, the boatswain Pedro Flores, for bad observations at sea and poor tightening of the rigging. The rigging has to be just so tight and no more when there's a storm. And then the other person who caught the wrath was Juan Quintero, who was the first pilot, the pilot most in charge. Now, Del Bio complained to the Spanish officials about Quintero, saying bitterly that he was a drunkard and he was often not at his position doing any of his observations properly, and that he would drink until he passed out, and so he wasn't available for anything. So the investigators, like good investigators, then turned upon Quintero and said, "Your captain has accused you of being, very drunk and passing out from drink. What do you have to say for yourself?" And Quintero said, hilariously, and it's in the records because the investigators were good bureaucrats, they wrote everything down in the records. Quintero said, "Well, yes, it's true, I do drink, but not so much as to lose consciousness."
functional alcoholic.
Right. The sort of thing that you would say perhaps if the police caught you, so to speak, red-handed. You have to
I've
see
had one
some.
or two.
Yeah, but not enough to get. As the records say, he was a piloto borracho, drunken pilot. So it seems that Del Bio was right about his drunkenness. So they repaired the ship, they reloaded the cargo, new cargo was taken on, all the officers were changed, except for Del Bio himself, and the crew was reorganized, and the 1693 trip was getting ready to go.
1693. They left a little late, if I remember correctly. A quick note from post-production. Del Bio and his crew left on July 1st, 1693. And now back to the conversation.
They left late. Yeah, the storms that were and are an important aspect of the Embocadero, the San Bernardino Straits, are really serious storms, monsoons, very serious storms. And the Embocadero is a long, rather twisty passageway between islands with straits and channels, and you really have to know what you're doing in
Mhm.
there. And it's very preferable to get out of there before the monsoon season really hits. They should have left about a month before they did leave, and that didn't help the situation very much. It doesn't appear from the records that that was Del Bio's fault. That was just finishing up everything that had to be done. But anyhow, they left late. The real key to the matter, apart from leaving late, was that Del Bio left at night. He sneaked out of the port and he left some 30 crew members and a lot of supplies on shore. So we don't know which crew members it was, but every man was really important on a Manila Galleon. Some were soldiers who were on board in case pirates, like English pirates or Dutch pirates,
Mhm.
caught them at sea. Some were carpenters, that were sailmakers, caulkers, the people who were needed to keep the ship afloat. So every man was important, and to leave 30 men ashore was a very big deal.
These were likely the men who may have saved the galleon when they had to do the arribada.
They may have been. We don't know for sure because the records don't tell us which men were left ashore.
Cool.
But the question has to be, why did he do it?
Right.
Why did he sneak out at night? So the only thing we know is what the port officials and the Spanish officials said, which was part of the verdict from at least the initial verdict. They were still continuing to do investigation, even though the ship was leaving for Acapulco. But the initial verdict was that Del Valle would, even though he was exonerated from causing the arribada, he would still have to pay from his own funds the tax to allow him to leave port and some other taxes. And the official report says he didn't want to do that. And my thought about that is, if I were in his shoes, I would say that I was unjustly treated. I had been exonerated from the arribada, and yet I was required to pay from my own pocket the taxes required to leave port, and some of the taxes, or not taxes, but the reparations for having ruined that year's economy. That would seem unjust.
It's a lot to put on one man's shoulders.
My guess is that he was feeling angry and unjustly treated and didn't want to pay all that. And so we don't know exactly how much it was, but it was clearly fairly substantial. And so he sneaked out of port in the night. And that had, I suspect, a lot to do with the fact that ultimately there was a wreck in a completely unknown place. The ship may have been weaker after its repairs. Repairs usually are not, leave a ship weaker than it started. But there was also the matter of having many fewer crew than necessary. And what were the supplies that he left on shore? Was it additional sails? Was it food?
Right.
That's really important. We don't know. It just says supplies. But it was probably things that were really necessary for a really long trip.
Well, we all know he got most of the, stuff worth money back on board, because we have evidence of the beeswax and the porcelain on the beaches in Nehalem.
Right. The cargo was on board, but supplies is a different matter.
Right. Don't worry, guys. I got the money.
Right. And so we don't know exactly when the wreck was, but the worst period of storms on the Oregon coast is from about November 1 through the end of February. So we could guess that probably it was somewhere between November 1693 and February 1694 that the ship wrecked on the coast. We also don't know how far north it was when it started. They had to, in order to catch the trade winds going the right direction, they had to go further north from the Philippines in order to cross the Pacific. And then when they sighted the North American continent, they had still some 2,000 miles to go to Acapulco. So they were supposed to sight the continent in the general vicinity of Cape Mendocino, which is south of Oregon. It's in Northern California. But the navigation across the stormy North Pacific was very imprecise. So they could have easily been at the mid part of the coast, of the Oregon coast, rather than further south at Cape Mendocino, and caught in a storm and pushed further north. That's probably what happened. Something like that.
Well, I mean, the storm in the October area, when they were still in the Embocadero in 1692 during that voyage, that pushed them back, like 30 degrees? Like he got knocked off course.
Yeah, you can get seriously knocked off course by a major storm. And we must not forget something that is sometimes forgotten. The storm patterns in the Northwest come out of Alaska, and in the winter, the currents close to the coast start flowing north. And in the summer, they turn and it flows south. But once the Manila Galleon got trapped in the currents fairly close to the shore, they would additionally be pulled north, even if they didn't want to be.
Right. And they're just kind of at the mercy of the ocean at that point.
Well, let's remember here something that we tend to forget now that we have motors and huge engines and dramatically enormous ships compared to Manila Galleon, which were some of the largest ships of the time, but nothing compared to the Titanic, much less a modern cargo ship, right? So if you're on a ship like that and you're in the middle of a storm, you're done. All you can do, you can lower the sails to reduce the wind shear on your ship. You can try to set an anchor, which will probably not work. It's likely to get jerked up if it even reaches the substrate at all. And you can try to steer a course and stay out to sea as much as possible, because you don't want to get smacked against a headland or a shallow place, right?
Right, or any of the rocks along the Oregon coast.
Right, all the haystacks.
Shipwreck coast.
So My guess is they tried to do all those things,
Yeah.
and the wind kept at them, and they were trapped in this northward flowing current. Their sails were probably shredded to bits. This was after 6 or so months, so they all had scurvy. Some percentage of the crew had surely already died, maybe up to 20 or 30%, plus the 30 men that had been left in Manila in the first place. Food was low, morale was terrible. The wind was shrieking through what remained of the shredded sails. And at a certain point, really, all you can do is pray and watch how the wind is sending you onto the coast. There's nothing else you can do. I think it was genuinely terrible. And then at some point, the mariners heard the worst sound that a mariner will ever hear. Crack. Whether it happened on the Nehalem Spit or whether they sailed head on into Neocani Mountain, either way, one time, at one point or another, they heard the terrible sound of the ship hitting the ground.
And then they swam for it.
If it landed on the Nehalem Spit, which is what is currently thought to be the case, or landed offshore of Nehalem Spit, rather than smashing head on into Neocani Mountain, in which had very few survivors. But if they landed offshore of Nehalem Spit, they could have swum ashore, many of them, if they could swim. The very few native traditions remaining about this event do seem to indicate that quite a few men survived, maybe as many as 50 to 80.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. And it's especially a lot if you're a small community of native peoples living on the coast. 50
Right.
to 80 bedraggled, half starving, half drowned men staggering ashore is a lot.
That makes me wonder if there was some sort of rescue effort. And maybe not in, like, in a modern sense where, we're sending boats out and life rings or anything, but in the way that they either washed up on shore and were then collected and helped onto the sand and out of the high tide range, or if they had strong enough survivors that the other stronger survivors were able to help the weaker ones. With a number that high, that is so many people to have survived. That's a lot, and yeah, the stress that would put on an indigenous community that's not made, or it doesn't have the economic resources to be able to feed another small settlement of people, essentially, that's gonna put some stresses on people.
And that's probably what happened. It's not clear how many people got to shore, but if they were not far offshore at Nehalem Spit, they could have easily, or not easily, but possibly swum ashore because the waves are also going towards the shore.
Right.
And
Body surfing.
there's cargo things drifting around possibly that you could hold on to
That is
in
true.
order to help you get to shore. My guess is that some people helped other people, get to shore. And
Ride that beeswax like a surfboard.
yeah, or a barrel full of who knows what, that was
Mhm.
bobbing in the waves. So there's some indication that the remaining crew, there were a few passengers. There were 6 priests on board, and also a captain of soldiers in Mexico and a couple of merchants. And if they survived, everybody would have staggered ashore. There's some indications from some native testimony that possibly they built crude shelters on the coast, like from driftwood, to try to shelter some of the cargo. They were hoping probably for rescue because they didn't know exactly how north they were, but
Mhm.
clearly they were not near Acapulco because it's much too cold and rainy and snowy.
Well, and
So
I don't know how many of our listeners are on the northwest coast of the United States, but it's cold water. Even in the summertime, it is not warm. You still need a wetsuit to go any kind of surfing at the beach, even in the summer. And my family is all from California, and even we don't swim in the ocean as far south as Bakersfield and Pismo. We don't go in the water because it's too cold. And so if you go even further north, up into Juan de Fuca Bay and even further north than that into, like, the Vancouver area and Cannon Beach and Neocani even further south, it's cold water.
it's cold water, and in the winter, there's long, savage storms of slashing gray rain, sleet sometimes, snow sometimes. And if you're a half-drowned Manila Galleon survivor on a coast that you don't know, you're not in great shape.
In
So
the middle of
they
winter.
they probably it was the middle of winter
Yeah.
already. They probably did build driftwood shelters, try to save what cargo they could, hoping for rescue. And indeed, we know from records in Mexico and Spain that Spanish officials did search for the Santo Cristo for years. For at least 5 years, they kept searching for it. And they kept going farther and farther north trying to find it. They went up at least as far as San Diego,
Oh no.
which is, a couple thousand miles probably
Right.
from central, the North Oregon
Oh
coast.
no.
So farther than that, they did not go. And all the men, let's remember here before I get to this part that there were also children on board these galleons because the cabin boys and the apprentices were all young Spanish or Filipino boys, mostly press ganged from the streets of Seville or Manila, who were between the ages of 10 and 12 or 13. So there were boys on board. We would refer to them as children, or young teenagers at the very most. It appears from what little we have from oral tradition from the native communities of the coast that conflicts arose of several kinds. One of them probably was food because the castaways would have to rely on the local natives for food. Their powder was all wet if they even had any guns, and they weren't familiar with what to eat or where to find what to eat. So there was surely food controversy and conflict. The Tillamook, which were the native people of the area, were a slave society. And so some of the galleon's men may have become slaves in order to have food and shelter. There also seems to have been conflict over women.
The
That
white men had become obnoxious.
uh,
That's my favorite
sailors
line from the 1908 article.
remember that the majority of sailors on Manila galleons were Filipino.
Mhm.
The officers were Spanish, generally, or Basque, but the sailors were almost always Filipino. So it was at least 80% of the men on board were Filipino. So there were no women on board so far as we know. So it's not surprising that after 6 or 7 or 8 months, there was conflict over women. And especially since these were men who, as time went by, became increasingly certain that they were going to die where they had landed. And that did turn out to be the case. As far as we know from the remaining oral tradition, there was a massacre of all the men at one
Mhm.
point as a result of all these conflicts with women, with food, with just their general presence. And that was the sad and sorrowful end of the Santo Cristo de Burgos. I have to say that this kind of scenario was a somewhat common one in the age of sail, because if people landed on a big ocean going ship on a foreign shore where they had nothing in common with the
Right.
local people, nothing to give, no reciprocity was available, no economy, they relied completely on a community that didn't know, understand, or care about them, and the reverse was also true. Massacres and things like that were more common than not.
Culture clashes talked about today, but it was some kinda animal back then.
It was very different, much more potent, much more total.
Mhm.
It was a 100% misunderstanding between the two cultures. A Filipino sailor looking upon a Tillamook warrior, what would he have thought? It's not like
Right.
much of anything at home. What would a Tillamook have thought seeing a Spanish officer with gold buttons? What's a gold button? He never saw that.
It's so shiny.
It's very shiny. What about a blacksmith who can do magical things with iron? That's not necessarily explainable in another belief system and
Mhm.
could be seen as really malevolent. And so and they didn't speak in each other's languages or anything even remotely related to it. So the massacre was kind of the end of everything. And as I said, there were children involved here too. So the massacre involved, fairly large number of people. And then the galleon was left to it. Presumably, the Tillamook investigated the cargo that was ashore and took what was useful. We do know from later oral tradition that they had not seen beeswax before because beeswax didn't exist in the
Right.
Americas, but they experimented with it and discovered its importance for light. But more important to them was its value for waterproofing. They had plenty of things for light, lots of wood on the Oregon coast. Waterproofing is a different matter. So they apparently used a lot of the beeswax for waterproofing.
That's cool. They also some of the porcelain that's been found on the Akani has been formed into projectile point knives, as
Yes,
well. And
very,
in
very
some
delicate,
cases.
beautiful
Mhm.
arrowhead points made out of Chinese porcelain. There's one in the Tillamook Museum that's just looks it's just as
That's so
beautiful
cool.
as anything. Somebody had a really delicate, fine craftsman skill to make an arrowhead point out of Chinese porcelain. I wouldn't wanna try it. I would break it right in half.
Yeah. It's so fragile, and it doesn't flake like flint or chert does. It's so
No.
different. And or obsidian, or I guess obsidian might actually be a pretty close comparison, compared to the other things that you can make, arrowheads out of, but
My
they
guess was it was an arrowhead to show one's skill or one's closeness to an area that brought in all kinds of exotic things like blue and white
right.
porcelain.
And
And
as I understand, they also traded some of the beeswax as well.
and porcelain also.
Mhm.
We do know that beeswax was traded because the very first mention of anything related to the galleon is in the very first Anglo chronicle of the Northwest Coast, which was Lewis and Clark.
That's right.
The Lewis and Clark expedition wintered on Clatsop Spit in 1805-06, and it's recorded in the journals of several of the members that Clatsop people came with beeswax to trade.
They
And
called it bear wax?
so one of the journal members correctly referred to it as beeswax, but it was either Lewis himself or Clark, I forget which one, who were both notoriously terrible spellers, referred to it in their journal as bear's wax, which has stumped historians for a really long time because bears have nothing to do with wax. One of the other expedition members, I think it was Joseph Whitehouse, did correctly write in his journal beeswax, and that's what it was.
So, these beeswax chunks and these porcelain elements, are really the only things that can survive in the ocean, and so those are the things that are washing up on these Neoconi shores and in this area, and so for 300 years, these rumors were swirling because you have oral history from the First Nation peoples that are along the coast, and then you have these mystery artifacts that are showing up on the beaches of this beautiful porcelain and these giant hunks of beeswax with mystery symbols carved into it. And so it sparks all these myths and legends and treasure stories and the Goonies and so many of these historical romanticisms that come in, and you hear stories of like, oh, there's pirate treasure on the Oregon coast, oh, there's Spanish galleon gold just sitting in the water somewhere, or like it's shoved in a hole somewhere on Neoconi Mountain. And so it's so much more to it than just a treasure chest in the middle of the woods. Like these folks are responsible essentially for first contact with the Clatsop and the Tillamook people.
Certainly so. The treasure machine that eventually became so all-encompassing for the Neoconi area didn't start until Anglo-American settlement, which
Mhm.
began in the early or mid 1800s in that area.
Yeah,
And
that's destiny.
Astoria itself was founded in 1811 up there further north, but in the Tillamook area where closer to the Galleon, there was early settlement, early explorers by maybe the 1820s or so, the early 1820s. And some of the early settlers found an enormous, very enormous amounts of beeswax and took it to Astoria and sold it because it was pure beeswax and it was a good price for candles. And some pioneers made quite a nice little bit of extra income, which was great, gratefully appreciated from the beeswax. Early stories from the newspapers and reminiscences always focused, for some reason, on it being pirate gold, a pirate ship. Maybe because it's more exciting, I don't really
Right.
know.
But it's not like Florida where you're finding just, like, gold doubloons and necklaces and chains all over the beaches.
Which nobody has ever found that here. There's no
Right.
balloons on the beaches. But the local newspapers, especially on by the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, were always looking for an interesting story. And what's more interesting than pirate gold? So there were always stories about the ship that ran aground and the pirate gold, and they to add verisimilitude, they would say this was a story told by an old Indian woman. The idea being that the Indian people had been here, and so they ought to know. because there were not Anglos here earlier when the ship wrecked. So it became a regular trope that the ship that had wrecked was probably, mostly, generally speaking, they thought it was Spanish, and in that they were correct. There were a few outliers who said it was maybe Japanese or Chinese, but most people thought it was probably Spanish, and that it was pirate treasure. And since people were finding beeswax and Chinese porcelain, they were finding something that wouldn't normally be on our coast.
There's definitely something out there.
There's definitely something. And then there were a couple of storytellers and a fiction writer out of McMinnville who wrote many stories about the galleon and about the pirate treasure and all of that. Thomas Rogers was his name, and he was a druggist in McMinnville, and he just loved the galleon. He wrote a whole novel about it and many pirate stories, and they're really rip-roaring stories about finding pirate treasure in caves. And as a result of his work and the local news stories and the early settlers finding, beeswax and making some money off it, the Neahkahnie Mountain area, which includes that whole Nehalem Spit, became the premier Oregon location for treasure hunting. Even in the mid-19th century, probably the first treasure hunter was Hiram Smith and his son Pat Smith, along with Charlie Pike, and they began to dig and always were talking about the wonderful treasure that they expected to find there. When developers came to the coast, they picked up on that story right away because it's such an exciting story. It sells houses, right? So
treasure in your backyard.
That's right. So Sam Reed, who was a developer who developed the Neahkahnie development starting in 1907, he would always allow seekers to dig for treasure, and he even would give people, shovels. That resulted in quite a few pits on the shoulders of Neahkahnie Mountain that were 30 or even 80 feet deep.
Oh no.
Really deep pits that you could break your neck in.
I live in Utah. We have just mine shafts that you can just walk right into.
Right, and even more on Neahkahnie, if there's a hole that's all covered with brush, so you can't hole anymore, and you just walk, all of a sudden you're walking on air, and there you go. And there have been elk and local creatures killed in those pits. The Neahkahnie Mountain area is part of Oswald State Park since the 1930s, but that didn't stop the treasure hunting. And it got a nickname, the Mountain of a Thousand Holes, because so many people digging.
I want to make so many jokes about that.
It's a funny name, but unfortunately it was truer rather than untrue. The most persistent treasure hunter in the 20th century was a man named Tony Moreno. And his actual name was Ed Fire. He was a house painter in Salem, but he went by the name of Tony Moreno. And he dug deep holes right on the beach, where people could just walk down the beach and see what he was doing. And the state said he needed an archaeological permit, but he couldn't get one because there was kind of a peculiar requirement who you had to go to. So he went to his state representative, and Oregon passed a treasure trove law in 1967 that allowed a treasure trove permit to be gotten on application to what's now the Department of State Lands. And all these treasure trove permits are still available. They're in state records, and you can see what the treasure hunters wrote down, what they were looking at, what mythology they were starting with for their hunting. Most of the treasure hunters, including Moreno, had some kind of Spanish gloss on their ideas. Moreno said that he knew the Spanish adventurers had interpreted the Bible and inscribed stones and left treasure worth, get this, $20 billion. Another couple of treasure hunters, Bud Kretzinger and Lloyd Grimes, they said that they interpreted natural lines on weathered basalt stones as Spanish marks. And they often used heavy equipment on Neahkahnie Mountain, which was really a concern to state officials. One seeker said he knew the Indians had hidden the gold and he wanted maps to Indian village sites so he could find it, which really made the archaeologists in the state very nervous, as well as the tribes. One seeker was we don't know his name, but he was absolutely certain that the Ark of the Covenant from the Bible was on Neahkahnie Mountain. I mean, there's just wild, flowering mythology. It's one of the best sites for folklore in the whole United States. Just massively creative, interesting, fabulous folklore about the gold and the Spanish and the Bible, and it's just marvelous. But the actual treasure hunting itself was causing havoc to the land. And we know that at least 3 people died from treasure searching in the Neocani area, 2 from being smothered in sand, digging a deep hole on on the beach, and the sand fell in on top of them. Another 2 were rappelling down Neocani Mountain to one of the sea caves at the base, and the waves got one of them. The other one was rescued, but one was drowned. So with all that and all of the holes and the troubles that were happening as a result of the treasure hunting, the state put a moratorium on the treasure trove statute in 1989. And finally, in 1999, they repealed it. So there's no more treasure hunting on state lands in the area. In Oswald State Park on Neocani Mountain, no more. If you find a piece of porcelain on the beach, you can pick it up, but you can't go hunting and digging holes.
You still can't keep it. It is property of Oregon State.
Right. So it's interesting. What's really interesting to me is that the galleon wreck, there was a terrible tragedy, a culture clash, but then the galleon had this enormous 300-year afterlife of treasure hunting. You're very colorful and very strange and wonderful. And now it's having another afterlife in archaeology and history. And ultimately, I and my co-authors wrote up this entire story in Oregon Historical Quarterly, which was published in the summer 2018 issue. It was the entire issue. And so we have put the galleon back into Oregon history where it belongs.
Yeah. And that's actually a huge source for this episode of the podcast is you and Doug and Esther's write-up for all of this. That's Doug Dewar and Esther Gonzalez. And this has been a massive undertaking. It's several articles, though. It's not just one singular article. It is several.
Yeah, it's four articles plus one by the archaeological team that we invited to tell how they did their sleuthing to find out which ship it probably was. And I have to say that one of the, and of course the painting of Del Bio is in the article, but the other thing that's in the article is one of the things that Esther found was a complete crew list because of all the troubles with the galleon coming back from Arribada.
Right.
And I insisted that the entire crew list be published in the middle of the article, not as an appendix, but in the middle of the article where it belonged, even though it's several pages long, because all these men died either at sea on the way to Acapulco.
This is their obituary.
Or on the Oregon coast. And it's the only, way they're ever going to be known. So we published it, they published it right in the middle of the article as I hoped they would.
That's really cool. Welcome back, everyone. And thanks again for joining us. Our story today starts on the northwest Oregon coast, where 300 years of legends tell of buried treasure and lost galleons full of rich cargo. From the late 1960s and until the end of the millennium, Oregon permitted treasure hunting along its rocky beaches. And during the 32-ish years that Oregon allowed this, 93% of the permit requests were for the Neocani area, just north of Nehalem Bay. For almost 300 years, legends of a shipwreck and buried treasure, only encouraged by movies like The Goonies, permeated the local gossip, indigenous oral tradition, as well as historic periodicals. Seemingly all confirmed by the beeswax chunks and the little pieces of porcelain that were washing up along the shores. No one really knew the true story. Oregon's coastline is littered with shipwrecks. It could have been any one of them. They thought maybe it could be one, or it could be 3. It is, after all, a very rocky, very dangerous coastline. Only 4 Manila Galleons, part of a trade route in the Pacific Ocean that went from Manila, Philippines, to around San Francisco latitudes, and then south along the North American coastline down to Acapulco, New Spain at that point, Mexico today. Only 4 Manila galleons were ever truly lost to Spain. Spain was pretty good at keeping a record of where their galleons sank. They knew at least kind of general areas, and they could send people out to go and recover cargo that was possibly just floating around in the ocean where their galleon had sank. The thing about galleons, it's like putting half of your economy on a boat and then watching it sail off into the sunset. fingers crossed, it makes it to its destination. There are so many things that can go wrong. And this poor shipwreck just had everything go wrong. But we know this because the researchers have done the work. There were only 4 ships completely lost that Spain had no idea what was going on with. That was the San Juanillo, lost in 1578, the San Juan, lost in 1586, the Santo Cristo de Burgos, lost in 1693, and the San Francisco Javier, lost in 1705. Now, 3 of those ships are still missing. We still don't know what happened to them, but we have been able to identify one. And by we, I mean the scientists that have been working on this. Now, Spain lost more ships than that. Ships sink all the time. But because Spain kept really good records, only 4 were the ones that went missing. Now 2 can be ruled out because the porcelain that continuously washes up on shores of Niakani Bay is Kangxi-style porcelain from the Qing dynasty, which is a revival of Song dynasty technique. What that means is they've been able to use the patterns that are on these little bits of china, these porcelain pieces, and identify them specifically to a time frame. The Qing dynasty was right around the turn of the 18th century. So the San Juan and the San Juanillo, which were lost before the turn of the 17th century, are too early. Now the San Juan and the San Juanillo were likely still carrying these luxury goods. However, the Santo Cristo de Burgos and the San Francisco Javier are now the 2 most likely culprits. Researchers with the Maritime Archaeology Society out of Astoria, Oregon, started the Beeswax wreck project in 2006-ish. Now, it was slow going, there was not a lot of funding going around, and they did a lot of the research on their own. However, around 2017-2018, they had a breakthrough. Geologists and geomorphologists were able to take a look with ground-penetrating radar and see a record of what happened within the strata of the Earth itself. Let the beach tell the story. And here's where context becomes so important, because these artifacts are key to this. Using the placement of the artifacts, scientists were able to determine when exactly this shipwreck had sank. Here's the thing. They initially thought that the Santo Cristo de Burgos had burned off the coast of the Marianas Islands. Additionally, something to note, there was a massive, catastrophic earthquake that struck the Cascadia fault line in 1700. So between the loss of these 2 ships. So because of the tsunami, scientists assumed it would have destroyed whatever was left of this shipwreck. And so they assumed initially that this shipwreck was the San Francisco Javier, based on the story of the Santo Cristo de Burgos' destruction off the coast of the Marianas, as well as the possibility that a tsunami would have destroyed any remains of what could have been of the Santo Cristo had it been that shipwreck. So initially there's this hypothesis. Because I want to talk about the earthquake real quick. This earthquake was catastrophic. Quoting from Earthquakes Canada, quote, "The earthquake shaking collapsed houses of the Cowichan people on Vancouver Island and caused numerous landslides. The shaking was so violent that people could not stand and so prolonged that it made them sick. On the west coast of Vancouver Island, the tsunami completely destroyed the winter village of the Pachena Bay people with no survivors. These events are recorded in the oral traditions of the First Nations people on Vancouver Island. The tsunami swept across the Pacific, also causing destruction along the Pacific coast of Japan. It is the accurate descriptions of the tsunami and the accurate timekeeping by the Japanese that allows us to confidently know the size and exact time of this great earthquake." End quote. And according to the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, this happened in what's called the Cascadia Subduction Zone. This megathrust fault is over 1,000 kilometers long, and it stretches from northern Vancouver Island to Cape Mendocino, California. The Juan de Fuca plate moved towards and ultimately was shoved beneath the North American plate. Fun fact, the Juan de Fuca plate is actually just disappearing. It is getting eaten by the North American plate. I cannot understate how enormous this earthquake was. So the scientists with the Maritime Archaeology Society weren't far off in thinking that the tsunami would have destroyed any remains of any kind of shipwreck in the bay. So the San Francisco Javier hypothesis makes sense. But something wasn't adding up for the scientists, and they found that there's artifacts within the strata that they're finding in this tsunami debris and this tsunami gunk that they're finding at like 50, 75 feet above sea level. This is something that storm waves won't reach, something normal wave height doesn't accomplish. The only way these artifacts would have been at that level is if a tsunami had pushed them there, indicating the shipwreck had happened before the tsunami, not after. These scientists, Scott Williams, Kurt D. Peterson, Mitch Markin, and Richard Rogers, wrote up their findings for the Oregon Historical Quarterly in 2018, which was a series of articles, a special edition, that was primarily focused on this shipwreck, which has been nicknamed the Beeswax wreck, for the beeswax that it deposited on the beaches. Additionally, there were 3 other articles written by Cameron LaFollette, our guest on today's episode. LaFollette, together with Douglas Dürr and Esther Gonzalez, as well as several other researchers from around the world, were then able to take the name of the shipwreck, the Santo Cristo de Burgos, now that the archaeologists had named it, and she was able to run with it. In her interview on the show today, Cameron LaFollette is going to go over how she figured out what happened to the Santo Cristo de Burgos. What we don't talk about is an exact timeline, so let me give that to you prefaced here before we go into the interview. The Santo Cristo de Burgos was built in Sorsogon, Philippines in 1687, possibly 1688, and it had been making regular trips with no issue to Acapulco, quote-unquote, New Spain, modern-day Mexico, for a couple of years with no issue. But in 1690, it had a highly irregular voyage. Francisco de Arcocha, the commander of the Santo Cristo de Burgos, arrived in New Spain on schedule, but Gaspar de la Cerda Silva Sandoval y Mendoza, 8th Count of Galve and Viceroy of New Spain, fired Arcocha and replaced him with a man named Don Bernardo Iñiguez del Valle, along with the bosun, the master, and the sergeant major. These changes surprised the crew, and it ruined de Arcocha and his reputation. He didn't do this for no reason, although it was petty. It seems that on the voyage prior, de Arcocha had transported Don Gabriel de Arnedo y Escudero, whom de la Cerda wanted as commander instead of de Arcocha, calling him, quote, a gentleman of his household. It was also the reason de la Cerda wanted de Arnedo as commander. He knew him. Arcocha, instead of ceding command to Escudero, simply kept him on as a passenger. For this perceived slight, and despite de Arcocha being appointed by the Spanish governor of the Philippines colony, de la Cerda fired de Arcocha, naming Del Valle as the new commander, and replaced the other leadership as a point of likely staving off mutiny to make the trip back to Manila. They returned to Manila in 1691, along with about 155,500 pesos from the crown to help with the maintenance of the colony, a little over 24,000 of which was set aside for the ecclesiastical needs of the missionaries there. Like I said, these galleons are lifelines, and without them, colonies can sink just like their ships. The Santo Cristo de Burgos would not set sail again until 1692. But that voyage was disastrous. Around October, Del Valle and his crew entered a storm that severely damaged the foremast and the mainmast. In an effort to mitigate some of the damage, Del Valle caused a chain of events that actually resulted in further loss. This damage caused the loss of 3 masts after they decided to attempt to cut them down. They rigged up provisional sails, and after calling a committee, a council, essentially, Del Valle and his crew decided to return to Manila in what's called an arribada in November of 1692. However, Delgado's committee decided not to return to Cavite and instead sought safety in the Bay of Naga, modern-day San Miguel Bay. It's still in the Manila region, but it's on the east side of the island. The shipyard there was not as outfitted as Cavite, and there was some debate among colony officials as to whether or not to repair the ship there, but they ultimately settled on, that's just what we're going to have to do. Del Bayo and his arribada cost the Philippine colony a full year of income, and it left the economy in shambles. There was no exchange of goods between New Spain's Acapulco and Manila, with essentially a chunk of the economy sitting on a beach in Naga Bay for the next 6 months. It was too late in the season for the Santo Cristo de Burgos to set sail again. It would take approximately 6 to 8 months to even reach Acapulco, and then another 3 months to return home to Manila. So there was only one galleon a year, and you only had a very small window of time in the spring to launch. And late June is playing fast and loose with that deadline. Manila galleons had a very treacherous route on the way to Acapulco, which is why it took more time to get there than to come home. The investigation continued into the following year, 1693, and Del Bayo, upset with some of the findings, and on July 1st, 1693, simply left, leaving behind approximately 30 men that he likely would have needed in the crossing. And that's where our record ends. But this is also where Cameron La Follette was able to take the clues and follow the breadcrumbs, and she has much more detail. Joining me today for our episode is Cameron La Follette, who has done a lot of the research on the Santo Cristo de Burgos and published a lot of her findings in the Oregon Historical Quarterly in 2018. Her articles are the main source for this episode. So because of that, let's bring her in to talk about it. How did a Spanish galleon wreck on the Pacific Northwest coast of America?
Well, what's interesting is that at the time that this wreck happens in the late 17th century, the 1600s, people know all about Spanish galleons sailing across the Atlantic and into the Caribbean. Some people may know the history of them down south, but up in the coasts of California, the coasts of Oregon and Washington and British Columbia, no, that's a land that isn't really known until the 19th century, right? Well, no. Spanish explorers had gone there starting more in in that time period, and had begun to chart the coast and knew different places. But at the same time that's happening, this Spanish trade that had begun early on to tap into the riches of the Far East, Asia, had commenced in 1565 with voyages of galleons that would sail across the Pacific from Acapulco, Mexico, to Manila in the Philippines, and there load all sorts of valued items that would then be brought back across the Pacific and landed in Mexico, and then loaded in Veracruz to be sent off to not only other colonies, but back home to Spain, all part of this vast global empire Spain had created in the aftermath of Columbus's voyages. The Manila galleons continued sailing up until the 19th century. And through those years, some were lost, but 3 ended up wrecking on the Pacific coast of America. And we know the names of at least 2 of them because the reports were there. One was the San Agustin, which wrecked north of San Francisco in what today is known as Drake's Bay. It wrecked while reconnoitering the coast, looking for evidence of English pirates, namely Francis Drake. It was caught in a storm, broke up on the beach, and archaeologists have found traces of it for years. I worked on a survey where we found where the wreck lies, buried in the sand off of the mouth of a tiny inlet. But what really tells the story are thousands of pieces of broken pottery. That's what they were carrying. It was a rich array of porcelains, other things, silks. The treasure was not gold or silver. They actually were shipping silver over to buy these things. They'd mine it in the New World. So the treasure that went was buying something of vastly more worth than tons of silver. It was beeswax, porcelains, fabrics, maybe some jewelry here and there, but it was that which the Far East had, which they desired in their homes. San Agustin wrecks in 1595. You've got another wreck that maybe the San Felipe, which wrecks in Baja California not too long after that. And then there's records of at least one other, maybe two other ships that wreck up the coast, according to the indigenous people there. But what are their names? Hard to say. And one of them that people talk about throughout the 19th century and well into our own times was a wreck that came to be known as the Beeswax wreck because of the large amounts of beeswax that were showing up on the beaches after storms, and which the tribes had talked about. The first time the first white explorers started to show up, they'd say, "Hey, look at this."
They had the Tillamook, the Silettes, and the Clatsop that I'm aware of. I wasn't sure if there were any others that were involved. I think it's the Silettes, Clatsop Confederated tribes.
The Grand Ronde, the
Mhm.
others, a number of those tribes had very strong histories, traditions, and some of the guys that came off of that ship are among their ancestors. But pieces of that porcelain and other things that came off of the beeswax wreck show up in sites up and down the coast and as far north as you're practically into British Columbia, because they were traded and carried about. Strange and interesting things, perhaps very beautiful, or just oh, okay, well, here's somebody from somewhere else. How strange is that? you know or the others who they said looked very different than the white guys because they were talking about Asians who were crew members
Mhm.
on the ships.
The Filipinos, likely.
Filipinos, but potentially Chinese, potentially even Japanese, some of whom were not obeying the dictates of the shogun and staying home, but had settled elsewhere.
Was the wreck a well-known story? What did the local tribes and settlers know? What did they talk about and pass down in either oral histories or journals or written evidence, pictorial? What is the kind of lore that came behind this shipwreck that was passed down?
The tribes were very clear that the wreck had happened in a time that was well within not living memory, but was one of at least a few that had happened. In fact, when Lewis and Clark arrived on the coast in the early 19th century, they met a man from one of the tribes whose hair was reddish and said his name was Soto because his father had been a sailor on one of those ships. Now, that's too recent to have been from the beeswax wreck, but there are other Spanish vessels that were on the coast that just went missing. So we suspect that there's other, quote, Spanish ships that are up in that part of the coast. But in the case of this wreck, the tribe showed them when they first came. The early settlers, the first fur traders in the early 19th century, were traded wax by the tribes because it was still a valuable commodity. Lewis and Clark went to look at some of it. And with that, people went there, and there was actually a business for a while in mining some of the wax because there were literally tons of it that had been packed and loaded into the ship. And the outline of the ship was seen from time to time by people bedded down in sand.
That makes me wonder if it would have been buried at some point just by ocean debris, and then after the tsunami, it just the whole I mean, I guess with the land rise and fall after the tsunami, I suppose probably a good chunk of several feet probably went with it.
Yes, what we suspect is, and there's been a lot of work that's been done. The locals are pretty clear. There's a piece here, there's a piece here, there's something that we could see in the surf. Ultimately, the people talked about in the 19th century about a number of timbers washed into caves that we would later end up working on. But other people talked about there's a section here, there's a bit of a mast that sticks up out of the sand dunes. It wasn't until the work was done that proved that the tsunami had happened and had picked up and carried a part of the ship away that it was able to be dated to before 1705. Now, before that, the thought was, yeah, it was probably the San Francisco Javier or some other, vessel, and particularly a wreck. When I first went and looked at this stuff back in the 1980s, everybody thought it was from the 1700s, where there's actually a name. Nobody knew about the Santo Cristo de Burgos at that stage because it was just a name in an archive, and it was a vessel that had just simply gone missing.
I know Cameron Follette, she had mentioned that there was an individual, he was kind of the authority on Manila trade, and he had distributed an apocryphal story that essentially the Santo Cristo de Burgos had burned off the coast of the Marianas. And so Spain kind of thought they knew what happened to it. And so they were like, no, it can't be that one. That one's already in flames 250 years ago, 300 or whatever it turned out to be. I can't do math well.
To your point, what happened to Santo Cristo de Burgos was somebody had misread the records a long time ago and said, oh, it burned in the Pacific. William Lytle Shirts, who wrote one of the great books about the Manila trade, just repeated that. But, never trust a secondary source.
Right. And that's the guy that wrote the book. Yes, I do have it in my notes. In 1939, historian William Shirts wrote that the Santo Cristo de Burgos burned near the Marianas Islands in the West Pacific in his History of the Manila Trade.
Exactly. But he was wrong, because what ultimately happens is, thanks to the work of Cameron La Follette and thanks to the archaeology, the clues begin to focus and come together. But before we go there, I just need to also acknowledge one other person. For years, a guy that I knew and knew well was Eb Gisecki. And Eb researched this, pulled all the accounts together, tromped all over there, and his research and his notes are really at the heart of where we now have come back to after having looked at all of this to try to figure out the pieces of the puzzle as to what happened. Is it Santo Cristo de Burgos? Yes. Yes, it can only be that through the process of deduction, because there's no other thing that wrecked before that time that just went missing. So it didn't end up in the Marianas. There it is. And the fact that you have wax with basically the logos, if you will, but the marks of people that the wax had been consigned to, who were on previous manifests of cargo shipped on Santo Cristo de Burgos. Yeah, there it is. Thank you, Cameron La Follette, and for all of that research she did and in pulling all of that out. So you've got that, but then you've also got Eb Gisecki saying, look here, look here, look here. And with that, the work has gradually focused more in and around Nehalem Bay and on the Spit, where there is wreckage there. It's buried under sand and water. It's also buried in sand dunes. And we have a pretty good idea of where it is because we have quietly gone and surveyed everywhere on land as well as underwater. And there is nothing offshore, nothing whatsoever. The wreck, other than what's close to the beach and then what got thrown up into the dunes by the tsunami. And what we ultimately ended up rescuing, well known to people for a long time, were these timbers that were rediscovered by Craig Andes, the beachcomber. And with that, calling for attention, saying, hey, this is, somebody should do something about this. The local historical society thought it couldn't be, as they've said, but ultimately said, yeah, it probably is. And just before COVID, I went out and gave a speech at their annual meeting. Craig came up and said, you need to look at this. And he showed me pictures. And I said, those are ship timbers. And he goes, yes. And they're like a hardwood. I went, he said, would they have survived? I said, they're in Sea Cave. Yeah. What was funny is that, of course, it almost felt sort of, I don't know, stereotypical, because that beeswax wreck was the origin story of many tales that ultimately got conflated and put together into the Goonies. So, yeah, I mean, through the entire project, we were always smiling, sometimes laughing, and saying to people, yes, no, seriously, there's a Spanish galleon sort of in caves, but it's pieces, it's not the whole thing. So with Craig pointing this out, working with the Maritime Archaeology and History Society, but most powerfully working with the state parks, Oregon State Parks, their archaeologists, it's in the park. It's a resource they manage. And with that, the idea was, okay, well, let's check this out. Moz had done that, and their documentation was very good. It's like, yes, everything was mapped, everything was laid out. And with that, and with Craig saying, yes, and I've gone and I've looked at this and this, we had a plan. But to get that work done meant close coordination with state parks, and not just state parks in terms of the rangers and access there, but also with their archaeologists, The coastal archaeologist, Stacy Scott, who had just arrived, new to the job, but had known about this and had done a lot of archaeology elsewhere, was key, but also the State Historic Preservation Office. My job was to basically pull everybody together and to see that it happened and to bring in the support of the National Geographic Society, which funded a lot of the work. It's thanks to that funding, both from the National Geographic Society and from Mallinson Sadler Productions, which actually produced Drain the Oceans and who came in to cover this, that the comprehensive survey was done offshore with instrumentation from Dr. Art Trembanis and his crew from the University of Delaware, leading scientists who understand coastal geomorphology and looking for wrecks. And it was Art who'd actually come up with the initial work that showed the preservation of and how things had shifted over time that was key to understanding a wreck now known to be Queen Anne's Revenge, the flagship of the pirate Blackbeard. So said, hey, Art, why don't you come on out? Drain the Oceans paid for that. And working off a chartered boat, they looked everywhere and found nothing other than the remains of a steel-hulled barge that had wrecked in the cove in the 1980s that in the last 40 years has systematically been torn apart, leaving practically nothing. So is there an actual wooden wreck in the cove? No. What he found was, based on the currents and studying this as a geomorphologist as well as an ocean scientist, looks like the entire upper part, maybe a piece of the deck, and probably the stern or the bow castle. These things were built with big decks and they had huge towering structures at both ends. One of those washed free and ended up in the cove and broke apart. How do we know that? Not just because of what Art and team showed us in terms of the currents and the movement of sand over time, but also that there are ramps from sand being washed into the cove that go directly into those caves. So you could see how the natural cycling and storms had just pushed things in there. Earthquakes had helped seal those caves, and now over time, erosion had washed away rocks and exposed them again. And after all these timbers were recovered and we began to analyze them, yep, that's part of an upper structure. Yep, that's a piece of deck. Yes, there's this and that. Now, we're looking at pieces of a puzzle in which the entire puzzle is gone, other than a handful of pieces. So as any of us who do puzzles know, that puzzle piece sometimes fits perfectly into its place. And even if we don't have the rest of the puzzle, we can say, yep, that's a frame from close to the waterline, thanks to archaeologist Charles Bendig's analysis. Yes, that's a section of deck. Charles really knows ships of that period. So with that, pieces begin to come together. And while they're scarce and scant, they still tell a story.
I remember looking at some of the bathymetry that had come from sonar and the survey that had come out of that. And it looks like one of those, I can't think of the word. It's like where you back your truck down into, like when you're towing a boat
Yeah,
and at the
like a
lake,
boat
and it's
ramp.
like boat ramp. Yeah, that's exactly what that ramp into that sea cave looks like. It looks like a boat ramp with the elevation and the angle that it's sitting at. It's so beautifully gradual.
So that's why everything moved there. You've got this washing machine that's the ocean there set on agitate, right? And it's throwing all these pieces up and they're getting thrown into there. They're wedged into rocks so they don't wash away. Some do. And they're thick, heavy pieces. They're made of teak or a teak-like wood. So they're not necessarily going to go away. Interestingly enough, we found one piece of wood that was Douglas fir that was part of a ship. And that, I think, is from a schooner that wrecked there in the 1850s. And lots of timbers from the Beeswax wreck, from the Santo Cristo de Burgos. Only one piece that we could say was likely from that schooner, probably buried in rocks and not then, washed away or eaten by marine organisms that live in the salt water. So there it was. But what this all meant was what we were working in, if you weren't in a boat, was an extremely dangerous environment. People die there all the time because these sneaker waves come in out of nowhere. You can be walking on that beach, you could be in those tide pools, and all of a sudden a big wall of water comes. And it's happened more than once. It happens in some cases almost every year somewhere up and down the coast. And there in that cove in particular, a father with his two children had been hiking They were hit by a wave. Dad made it, the kids didn't. So we had to approach this work very carefully. Yes, the timbers were significant, but we didn't, no injuries and nobody should die in trying to get these out. They were clues and they could tell more. So what ended up happening was a lot of discussion. I want to call out a few people. The Columbia River Maritime Museum convened meetings. The retired director of the Columbia River Maritime Museum, Jerry Ostermiller, who also has been a sheriff's department volunteer working with the deputies in cliff rescue, was key. Coast Guard, but likewise too, I mean, the entire team at the museum today, which also has been the repository for all sorts that people have rescued off of beaches, including a carved block used to help haul up sails, just a piece of it, still a little wave washed, but still with decorations carved into it, that a lady stopped her husband from throwing into a beach bonfire and brought to the museum. And it turned out to be a very diagnostic piece. And yes, this is from the rigging, it's from a ship of that time. And all of that. So the museum has always had a stake in this. So they organized, brought everybody together. And it was thanks to the various sheriffs, police, and the fire folks, as well as state park rangers, Bo, the lifeguard, state park archaeologists. Kyle lent from search. I stayed on the beach. I was not, I mean, there's old and there's
Try to
bold.
hike around the cliffs.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I maybe, if I'd been a few decades younger, but even then when I was a young guy, I was told by Master Sergeant Bowen when I was learning to dive, there are old divers, there are bold divers, there's no old, bold divers. And I just didn't want to be bold and old. We had a window of tides, and the higher the tides get, we did it at as low a tide we could. But even a low tide, if you get a wind or something coming in offshore, and then there are the sneakers. So, as I think people have seen in some of the photographs, there's the team. We thought initially of rappelling down, but there's all sorts of loose rock that continues to fall. Could we get a helicopter in? No. So it was hiking in and going over this stuff with dragon's teeth standing several feet high, coated in slick, wet seaweed that you could slip on, rocks that could break bones or cut you, and then going into the cave to try to crowbar out and lift this massive timber. To get it out, the team had to carry it out, wrap it in life jackets. Skidoos with fire rescue guys came in and towed them back onto the beach where the rest of us hauled them up. And
My favorite thing about archaeology is how untechnical it can be sometimes. Like, it's not a specialized flotation device. Like, this timber just got, like, strapped into some life jackets and, like, pushed out.
yes, and then hauled ashore as if they had been a victim in a cliff rescue, which is actually one of the things we very carefully suggested to the police and fire could help justify this exercise, which call it training, chief.
Yeah, put it in a body bag and just let the news crews know.
Well, I think with this one was they all wanted, it was cool. And I mean, yes, there were times for sure when there were Goonies jokes in those meetings, but no, we couldn't have done it. And in fact,
So
we didn't do it. It was the police, the fire, and the state park rangers who did it. The archaeologist stood by. Kyle was in there and helped lift and pull all of that out.
2022, I think that I was working for a magazine called Coffee or Die magazine, and we had Josh Scovland, who was another staff writer, and he did an article on the discovery of the Beeswax wreck because we focus on first responders and veterans issues, and so that's why it caught our magazine's attention, was because of the first responders that were so involved in the excavation of the Goonies shipwreck. And so it was very headline happy with that. But it was a story about the first responders who had pulled it out. Absolutely.
Yeah, they were. And I mean, I certainly got that and appreciated it as the son of a firefighter who grew up in and around Dad's firehouse. I mean, tremendous work, teamwork as always. Once everything came out and the state parks folks loaded up and brought it, we transported it to the Columbia River Maritime Museum, who are holding it all now, and started analyzing it. And with that, it began to tell its stories. It's fascinating. I mean, again, they're fragments, but they do have a story to tell. And part of that story is the disassembly of nature through tsunamis and ocean currents and earthquakes and rock falls and all the rest that not only tore the wreck apart, but also helped preserve parts of it. And so we now have a pretty clear sense. Yes, this is one area where part of the wreck went. Would it have been torn apart? Absolutely, because the Glen Eslin, which is this huge steel sailing ship that wrecked at the turn of the 19th into the early 20th century, it's sitting there in chunks with steel plates torn and twisted and bent as if, it had been blown apart, just wedged in the rocks at low tide. You can go and climb on them and take a look at them. So there was never a thought of we were going to have more than maybe a portion of the wreck in the cove. But what initially had been thought to be a portion of the wreck, as the Moz team had worked and dived, it had a magnetic hit or an influence. But it turns out that the volcanic rock there does have that same kind. It can look like a piece of a wreck when it's not. And if you start looking at striations in rocks and volcanic rock forms, you can convince yourself it's a plank.
Speaking of the plank, that piece of timber that you guys pulled out of the sea cave, what did you guys learn from that?
What we learned from that one piece was that it was part of a curved frame or a rib that was part of the upper body of the wreck, probably closer to the back end of the stern, that was probably at or above the waterline. It had been iron fastened, and we found traces of that. And we could even see when these were taken into the local hospital, which volunteered to do this, the patient still had iron tips of those spikes embedded deep inside the timbers that had not rusted out or gone away.
That's cool. Where is the rest of the ship?
The rest of the ship is likely ashore, buried in the sand dunes. Many of the local people know. This is a case where the wreck, it's not a question of finding it. It's been something that has been visited and people have looked at. And we've been hearing from people all along who said, yeah, I know people that have a piece of this. They have not only pieces of beeswax, they've got a piece of wood here or there. They've got a door off of the wreck, or they've got this other stuff that's in their house, but they're not going to tell anybody because they don't want it taken away. Other people talked about by the tree. If you go by the tree and you look on down, that's where the mast used to be. And right up to World War II, kids were digging out part of the wreck and using it as a fort. So
That's adorable.
it is. It's so with that, this is a wreck that has a long and storied history. And we can't just say it's all that happened in the past. We can't deny its importance and its significance to the local tribes, but it also has an importance and a significance to the community as well, because it's their wreck, it's their story. They've lived with it for centuries themselves. And even as new people move in, I mean, houses are being built. And we went to one house, and the lady, the retired mayor of the community, said, oh, yeah, he dug here. And there was all sorts of wax that came out right up against the end of a dune where things had washed back out after the tsunami. So, what does that mean? It means that whatever happens moving forward, this is an internationally important site that speaks to world history. But let's not forget that this is also local history, community history, tied to tribes and other communities, and it's a people story.
It's always about people, always. Which brings me to my next point. Because it's so attention grabbing and because it has such a personal hit on the storyline, and like I said, it is headline grabbing. This shipwreck, not only did my magazine report on it, but CNN picked it up. You got Fox News, you've got all of the mainstream guys that are picking things up, along with people like Archaeology magazine and Smithsonian and National Geographic. These are huge names in not only science but in publication. Were you surprised by the media turnout for this discovery and for this project?
No, because it's a shipwreck and they still seem to command the media attention. But also, let's be clear, a lot of people went, the Goonies! Goonies never say die. And of course, there was one point at which, yes, a certain party, not me, actually stood up by the cliffs and said, hey, you guys! The famous line from it. So, yes.
It was you, wasn't it?
It was not me. no, it was not. I laughed. Again, shipwrecks are powerful, and it's one thing that people talk about. When people find out what I do for a living, inevitably that leads to longer conversations because everybody knows about a shipwreck. And whether it's a Titanic or something that's not, it's powerful. But what's even more powerful is when it's not something far away, it's in your own backyard. And that's the reality of most history, is that a lot of these things are literally in somebody's backyard. Unless it's deep out in the middle of the ocean, in which case those nudibranchs and those sea anemones and those octopi and those whales, it's their backyard.
I love octopus. They're so cool.
They are. And they're inveterate collectors. When we work on wrecks off the Mediterranean, you see them, they take an old broken amphora and they see things that they like and they collect them and store them in their homes. That's why I do not eat octopus.
I can't. I went to a restaurant with my ex-boyfriend once. It was a Korean joint, and we had octopus on the table, and I was like, I can't do that. But it is interesting that when they cook, they all just like curl up just so perfectly. It is
Yeah.
odd.
Well, they are very intelligent, and I've seen that in the water. You can see it if you look in aquariums. And yeah, it didn't just take my octopus teacher as a film for a number of us. So anyway.
Aquariums, they've like stolen fish from other tanks and then gotten back into their tanks and then
Yeah.
closed the lid. No, I wasn't out. I was fine. Everything's good.
You looking at me? No, that wasn't me. So anyway.
The beeswax wreck is something that I've only known about for a couple of years, specifically because of my work with Search when I was working for the company. Tangential through Coffee or Die as well when I was working for the magazine. And so that's why I had access to see those bathymetrical charts and some of the topographical things.
At this stage now, what I like best is helping bring it all together, helping organize it. So yeah, I'm still out there. I still dive. I can do all this other stuff, but no, it's fun to be able to see younger colleagues go in and do it with the enthusiasm. And yes, I could do it, but then how do people gain the experience? How do they learn it? By doing it hands-on. And part of, the fortune I've had in being able to do what I have in a long career is now I get to pay it forward.
Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, folks, that's our show today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for listening again. I'm sorry about some of the audio issues. I'm still working out some of the kinks. I have switched from Google Meets to Zoom because you can record 2 audio inputs, which I was not aware of at the start of this podcast and wish someone had told me about. However, you can find us on all of the usual spots, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, Stitcher, Overcast, and iHeartRadio. We also have some social medias that you can check out if you are so inclined. We are, of course, on Twitter and Instagram as @NautiPodcast, NAUTI podcast. We also have an email if you would like to send us some suggestions for shipwrecks to cover. It is thenautipod@gmail.com. That's the NAUTI pod@gmail.com. And you can send us all kinds of things. Please keep it professional. We may be called the Naughty Archaeologist, but it's NAUTI, as in nautical. Don't make it weird. I will also do my best to get a hold of the individuals who are part of those projects and a part of that research. It is field season. Give them the summer. But I would love to hear what you guys think and any suggestions for improving sound quality. Be kind. We are also on YouTube and TikTok as @NautiPod. So there you have it, boys and girls. Let's get wet, nerds.